Yeah, my name is Roderick James Anton Horte, and they call me Rick. And the reason for that is my father's first name was Roderick as well. So he became Rod, and I became Rick. And my parents were married during the war, and I was born in Vancouver, moved to Chilliwack, and then my father left the army, and we moved to a farm in northern Alberta called Valhalla Center. And I was up there about 6, 7 years ago, I guess. So I had my childhood, early childhood, was spent on the farm. It was good fun, enjoyable. And then I have two sisters who now live in Victoria. And we just came back from a Christmas lunch just a few days ago. So it's been an interesting experience having them all sort of together again. It's the first time in 70, 80 years we've all been together. So, yeah, the family itself, were you interested in photography? No, not really. My parents were divorced after about 25 years of marriage, and they had their own interests, and my interest from photography came from within rather than from an outside source. I guess the initial entry or exposure to photography was a Christmas gift. It was one of those Bakelite Brownie cameras. And I had a friend whose mother asked me to take some photographs, and I did. And it's gone on from there. I enjoy the photography for a whole host of reasons, which I'm sure we're going to get into. But that was my initial exposure to photography. Fortunately, at the time, I had a paper route and I could finance my photography because in those days we had flash bulbs and film was expensive. Film was expensive to develop and print, and it wasn't a hobby that you would choose as a young boy and as a natural course of events unless you had some surplus cash. I think there are several things that keep me involved in photography. And one is the technical aspects. I've always been a very technically oriented individual, and as a result, the changes in photography over time, I find that it's fascinating. Although I'm perhaps starting to lag behind a bit with age. But the other thing that I find that really keeps me interested in photography is the meditative aspects. I find photography very meditative. And that I focus on something, and I completely divorce myself from all other aspects of my life, whether I'm breathing or sneezing or whatever. I find myself just focused on the subject that I'm trying to photograph, and I find that quite comforting. I always have, and I find it quite relaxing. And there's really two aspects to that. Really, one is taking the image itself, the photograph itself, and the other is processing it. I've always had a dark room or access to some form of processing, and again, I enter almost into a meditative state when I'm processing photographs. So there's several aspects there that I just really am drawn to it. I always keep coming back to it. My life has never been fairly easy, so I use that as a refuge, if you will. Well, the meditative aspects of photography are carried over into other aspects of my life. Tai Chi, which I've been practicing now for well over 30 years. And right now I'm practicing on the beach. And again, I just completely divorce myself from all other outside distractions. And I just carry on with that meditative approach. It's like skiing. You're so focused on your activity that you divorce yourself from all other aspects. You shut out any distractions whatsoever. The only time that hasn't happened was when I was playing rugby. Well, I started off in high school playing rugby. And from rugby in high school, I moved to, when I was working out in Australia, I played out there socially. And then I was working for McMillan Blodell in Powell River. And I'm one of the founding members of the Otago Rugby Club. I played second division over there. And we actually all played on the island. All our games were on the island, with the exception of the home games, of course. And so the rugby itself, I traveled up and down the island every weekend. I was away and playing a match somewhere. And I did play up first division, which was a bit of a mistake. I'm too light. I wasn't fast enough. And playing in the first division, playing up against guys who were weighing 250 pounds when you're only 160 pounds, it just doesn't work. And it's quite a painful exercise. I joined the club in 2014, and I was taking a photography course at the time that required me to join the club. And so I was just a regular member for the first year, and then about 2015, I joined the board of directors. And I lasted until about, I guess it was 2020. When I initially joined, I think there was approximately 35 members. And just before COVID, we were at 127, I think was the official number. And then, of course, after COVID, we dropped to 27 members, and then we're back up to where we are today, which is getting close to 70, 80 members again. The club's changed over time. When I initially started, they were all quite techie individuals, John Critchley and Jack Harnick and people like that. And it was fascinating because it fit my background. And I think today, if I think about the club and the club members, although they're still very technical, they're much artsier. They're looking more at photography from an artistic perspective rather than from a technical perspective. The club, of course, has usual challenges. We haven't got the member base to work with. When you're managing the club, you could organize all sorts of parties and fun things. We just don't have the membership to do that today. Well, for new members, I think it's important just to jump right in and join up, because there's many other aspects to the club's activities that you miss out on by just being a regular member and sitting out in the crowd and listening to the lectures. My first year was spent that way. And then I realized that there was a coffee clutch. People were talking about the coffee clutch, and I said, "What's that all about?" Well, you just come to coffee, and there was a notice that went out, and it was in the newsletter, which came out monthly. And my name had been left off the newsletter list, so I wasn't getting the newsletter. So when I inquired, they put me on the list. I joined up with the coffee clutch, and things started to become interesting at that point. And yes, there were a lot of challenges, but there were a lot of interesting people, and I think my photography improved because I was becoming a little more interested in the individuals. I was learning a lot more. And I think that over time, I've become a much better photographer because of it, being actively involved directly with the club. Well, the coffee clutch, I think it's a very important part of the club, because there's a lot of exchange that goes on there. There's a lot of networking, as we call it, going on. But the more interesting part is the social aspects. We get to know people. They bring their equipment with them. They take photographs. They talk about the photography. They talk about their personal life. They talk about social aspects of the club. And that in itself just makes for a richer experience. I mean, we've moved from lefties in Qualicum Beach when we had about 9 or 10 people show up, and the restaurant would sort of wring their hands because they weren't making any money, people sitting around drinking coffee. And to the farm, and we've moved, which the farm is a great location. It seems to be a little bit more friendly and open. And then there's, of course, a step above in Parksville, where we've been, and it's a nice winter location. It's nice and warm and dry, and we sit around a great round table, and you can see everybody and hear everybody. Well, for the most part, hear everybody. We've tried other locations. It don't seem to have worked as well. But again, there's still that camaraderie and the friendship that goes on at these meetings. And just sitting and having a coffee with a fellow photographer twice a month is an interesting and very pleasant experience. It's shooting alone or with a group, it doesn't really matter. I find if the meditative experience, I probably would have to say I prefer to shoot alone. But then you lose the other part of that shoot, and that is people suggesting ideas to you or see things that you don't see, and it draws your eye to them. So it becomes perhaps an interesting experience in itself, just shooting and stepping back from that meditative or focused experience that you're at if you're shooting alone. So I have to say that shooting with somebody else is probably a nicer and more enjoyable and more interesting experience. Well, speaking of photography, if you're looking for something special, you're always looking for the light. I took I guess it was at an education meeting, we did a little exercise one night on composing with light. And it was held by John Critchley at the time, and it was a very interesting experience. It always stayed in my mind, and I found it very interesting. So I always go for the light. How does it work? How is it affecting the photograph? What's pleasing about this photograph? And it usually turns out to be related to or directly related to the light. And I think that, to me, makes a great photograph or a great piece of art. The masks in the room here, the lights change from time to time during the day, and so they take on different aspects. But with photography, it's positional and fixed, and it's the light that's important, certainly from my perspective. And there are a couple of interesting things. There's a couple of stories about when you're doing portrait work, holding up your hand and looking at the light and seeing where the light is coming from and how it's affecting your hand and how it's going to affect the face or the portrait. The same thing with Karsh, and there's the famous story where the little girl comes up to a restaurant and she has a little brownie camera, and she asks him, how do I take a great photograph? And he takes her picture, hands her back the camera, and he says, once that's developed, go and study the light. And I think that's the most important part of photography. If I only had the choice of one place, well, that's an interesting subject. I think I can find an interesting subject anywhere. You're changing your technical the aspects that you're using in your camera. You're changing your lens. You're changing your technique, whether it's Ven Posa or close-up or doing whatever. So does it really matter where you're photographing? It could be your backyard, and I have a great backyard because I don't do much to it. Or I go down to the community park in Parksville. And when I do that, every time I go down to the beach, I always find something interesting to photograph, either people or trees or grass or water or clouds. And the same in my backyard. I go into the backyard, there's usually a flower coming up or a tree is coming into bloom. So it's really a matter of attitude. It's not a matter of location. And you just use your imagination, use your technical skills, and you can be anywhere. And you can create a great photograph. Well, because I'm not aging, but like a photographer who is aging, you need to take in a couple of things. The weight of your equipment, which is one I hear about all the time. And although I don't really believe the weight of the equipment is a problem. But there are things you can do to compensate for it. I have developed a tremor in my hands, so I shoot faster now than I did, 5 years ago. I try to use prompts. I use a monopod at times. I use tripods now. And I can overcome a lot of those issues with aging. But with age comes wisdom. And with wisdom and experience, you can become a better photographer. So I don't think there's any handicap or any downside to aging as a photographer. I think it's a wonderful hobby as you age because there's so many interesting aspects. You go down to the marina again. You can go down to the marina, as some of our members do, every day and photograph. And their photographs are different every time. So I don't think there's any with downside to being an aging photographer. Well, to an old photographer who thinks he's seen it all and done it all, I would have to say you haven't. The light changes, the scene changes, things grow, you age, everything is in a constant state of change. It's just a matter of recognizing and seeing the changes and photographing those changes and using your experience. With a younger photographer, you need to do a couple of things. First of all, master your camera. And once you've mastered your camera, shoot. Continually shoot everything from all aspects. Shoot a leaf on a tree, then get down on your hands and knees and shoot upward at the underside of the leaf or the side of the leaf. Just keep shooting from different aspects. And sooner or later, you start to develop a repertoire and a way of seeing that is completely different from some of your other photographs of photographers. One of the things that happens with photographers is they get a camera, they start taking pictures, and that's what they do. They take postcards. But that's not what you want to do with photography. Just taking a picture is just taking a picture. It's just a moment of time. But the artistic aspect of a photograph comes afterwards, once you've taken your photograph, your picture, and you start manipulating the light. Now you're really doing something artistic. So I think there's a whole range of things for a young photographer to consider. And I think the old photographer needs to reconsider how young he really is. The COVID thing was an interesting experience for the club and for myself personally. At the time, or just before COVID, I had left the board. I put in 5 years, and it was enough. And Lorraine Kuma had gone into the hospital, and in October she phoned me and asked me if I could help her manage the club. And which I said, yes, I would. And then she phoned me again in early December and said, it's going to be a long time before I get back to the club activities. Could you help out? Have you got some ideas on how to manage the club? And so the board of directors appointed me as a director and then as vice president of the club. I actually directed the club through the COVID period as vice president, but not as the president of the club. So the first problem that I ran up against was the communications. People started to lose interest in going to the websites. The newsletter was no longer being published, and club membership had dropped dramatically. So to overcome those problems, I created what was called the contact sheet, up-to-date events. We could hold some of our events out in the open and around, and we could, with the computers, we could submit our photographs and carry on. But the communications and not being able to have a regular monthly meeting and an education meeting hurt the club quite a bit, as it did with all other clubs. The financial situation with the club was strong, so I didn't have to worry too much about that. But having people participate, there was nothing you could do. The social aspects, we were going from a club that had well over 100 members with lots of social aspects going on, coffee clutches and other things, picnics and stuff, to a club that was just related to photography and we're operating off the internet. And that became a real problem for the club because it was a very social club at the time. The problems were not only related to Oceanside photographers, but to the rest of the clubs in the province and in the Yukon. And Kappa, to their credit, jumped in and started having Zoom meetings and all sorts of other educational training exercises going on the computer through Zoom. And we were able to participate in that. Yes, what else could you say about it? I mean, we just had to struggle and carry on through it. And most people recognized the problems, wanted to participate in photography, and carried on with the club. Yes, I started riding a motorcycle when I was 15 or 16. And I just gave up earlier this year my motorcycle riding. I sold my bike. It was a bit of a sad time, actually. Yeah, the motorcycling has allowed me to see a lot of the country. My wife and I rode out in Australia. I rode here. Of course, I gave it up for a while we were raising kids. But for the most part, I've ridden all over, certainly Western Canada, southern U.S., and I've had some wonderful experiences. Brand new motorcycle, riding in Alaska in the middle of nowhere, breaking down, and relying on a stranger, watching the grizzly bears cross the road at the same time. Not a pleasant experience. And then to get the letter when I got home that the bike had been recalled because of an electrical fault. And the other interesting story, I was out in the Death Valley, and I stopped at the side of the road, and there's signs all over the place, no stopping. I stopped at the side of the road to get some water. I no sooner brought the bike to a halt, and over a loudspeaker came, "Get back on your bike, continue riding." And there was a police car about 40 feet behind me, and I shook my water bottle at him, and the message came back loud and clear, "Get on your bike." Of course, this is the U.S., so you have some apprehension. So I drank my water and then climbed back on the bike. The cop came alongside me and said, "I thought I told you to get back on your bike." I said, "I'd probably make it another 20 feet on this bike if I didn't get a drink." And he just waved me on and I carried on. But yeah, no, I've had some wonderful experiences and been all over certainly the southwestern U.S., Alaska many times, and BC. And I've tried doing photography from the bike, not riding and shooting, but stopping and taking photographs. For me, it didn't work. And primarily because I like to think about my images before I take them, and then take them, you're consuming time. Stop and shoot. You chew up a half an hour of riding time, maybe sometimes even an hour's worth of riding time. And when you're trying to make another location by nighttime, it doesn't work. And you feel a bit rushed and you're under a bit of pressure. And I find my photography just wasn't there. I've done it in the car, which I find a little more relaxing, and I do get some interesting shots. But I've never really tried to combine motorcycling and photography. Yeah, I've looked at the various activities that I've been participating with, as Tai Chi or rugby or whatever, and motorcycles. And I've tried to incorporate them after the fact into photography, and it works. Um, and I've had some interesting experiences there. One of the courses again I took was I was required for the monthly submission was to do some sports photography, and I went up to shoot the uh, local football club as they were playing, and that was a very interesting experience. With sitting there with a long lens and trying to do something at the sidelines or in the end zone, only to find out that parents are far more aggressive than the players themselves. I don't know how many times I got shoved out of the way because I was trying to shoot a kid running down the field with a football, classic photograph of a football player, only to be nudged or bumped or pushed out of the way. So you have to choose your sport and choose your time and plan your shot. I don't think there's anything different than any other photography, but when it comes to doing some of these other incorporating other aspects of your life into your photography. Yeah, Tai Chi is interesting too, and so is the thing about Tai Chi, and I have to go back to the meditation, sitting there looking over the water because I do Tai Chi on the beach, and I say, that's beautiful, that's classic. The water is perfectly still, the mountains in the background. I'm going to come back and get my photography or whip my phone out and try and shoot that. I tend to lose the moment, or the wind comes up, or the clouds change. And you don't realize that when you're doing a landscape photograph, things actually change very quickly. And so I haven't really had a concerted effort to photograph some of these other activities. I have been thinking about doing a book on coastal British Columbia. They're calling it something along my British Columbia, my coastal British Columbia. And I have started collecting a number of photographs of ships and seascapes, places I've been. The thing with boats, after a while, they tend to be a little bit monotonous. Lots of pleasure crafts around, but I think there's far more interesting working boats available, fishing boats, tugs, towing scows, those types of things. Sailboat is a sailboat, although I was a sailor. So I find that the beach scenes, the sceneries, the logs, the mountain retreats, islands, stuff on the sand, down in the ground, far more interesting. Anyways, it's an ongoing project. I probably have somewhere around 20, maybe 30 images that I could use right now. But I thought I'll put a concerted effort into it early next year, and probably have the book produced probably by the end of the year. You can say I've been influenced by people in the club. There's one person in particular that stands out. Well, two actually, Jack Heronick and John Critchley. And John was a very technical person, very, very technical. I think he's taught me a lot, because he attempts to use that technical training that he has to incorporate it into his photographs and into the artistic aspect of taking a photograph. Something that I hadn't really considered many years ago, which I do consider now, is a quick review of all the numbers on the cameras, distance and stuff like that. And he's been very influential in some of my work. And one of the exercises that he did was had us do when he was doing some educational training was composing with light and just using light as a composition center of the photograph itself. Very interesting. Caused a lot of thinking to go on there. Jack Harinack, I'm always impressed with Jack because he's always out doing a lot of portrait work, and he does a very good job of it. And I enjoy portrait photography, and he's done quite a bit of work in that area, and he does some very good work. He's worth following. Well, equipment's an interesting subject. I've always been a bit of a technical person because I was a trained accountant, and I think when it comes to equipment, you could spend tons and tons of dough on equipment, and it doesn't make a hoot of difference to your photography. My favorite story about equipment was my D4, and I had a nice lens on it. We were up at the museum up in Courtenay. I had been shooting off a tripod, and for whatever reason, the bolt on the tripod holding the camera on and the lens snapped just out of the blue. Nobody was around it. It just toppled over and then tumbled down a set of concrete stairs. I lost my camera. It was smashed to pieces, parts all out of it. I lost my lens. I lost my tripod. Well, it resulted in an insurance claim. I ended up with a Nikon D850, brand new lens, brand new tripod. I still had a bit of cash left over for some filters. But I think it was Lorraine Kuma and I were standing in the hallway at the museum when that occurred. She said, "I'll be your witness if you need a witness." Where nobody touched it. But as far as equipment goes, I've come to the conclusion it really doesn't matter anymore. It's more about composition and light. And, you should also have a good roll of duct tape handy keep everything in place. I have some very fond memories of building a darkroom and processing my own and printing my own images. And as I think as a result of that, I have a bias towards black and white. I mean, color is wonderful. You can do some spectacular photographs with color. But color, there's always one aspect to it that is the color itself will detract from what you're trying to say in the photograph. Whether it's a composition or whatever else. You lose something with color, I think. But everything today is color. Our ads are all in color, our images are all in color, our cameras are geared for color. So we shoot in color. You bend to it, I guess. But if it comes down to a push comes to shove, I enjoy black and white. And getting those subtle tones, trying to get the differences between black and white. And if I was to shoot an image, I would prefer black and white over color. I used to belong to Project 365, which is to take an image every day, process it, and publish it every day. I did that for about 18 months, and then I tired of the project and left, and I've been back several times since. But that process and the discipline that takes to take an image every day and publish it is a healthy experience for every photographer. And when it comes to that type of photography, you look at Sandy Stewart comes to mind. She's a wonderful photographer, and she's shooting everything all the time. The thing about Sandy is that she's operating in a relatively, for the most part, a relatively confined space, the marina. It gets quite boring if you were just go down there and look at the marina every day, but every day she goes down and she finds something interesting. So what does that tell you something? It tells you that she's seeing. She's not taking photographs. That's not the point. She's seeing. Whether it's you're looking at a boat, seeing the reflection, seeing some aspect of a boat, a bolt, or a rusty plate, an anchor, whatever. It's something different every day because the light changes every day. Clouds, rain, whatever, she sees it. And to go through that sort of disciplinary process, she's remarkable, absolutely remarkable. Well, any discussion on the development of and processing photography and progressing from stills and glass plates to AI would require a lot of 8mm film. And I think what we're seeing here is just a progression up to a point. I enjoy manipulating my photographs in processing software, and I use On1, and I have used Photoshop and several other processing softwares, but today I use On1. And there are a lot of things I can do in On1. It just speeds up the processing time, where the manipulation is, I don't know, the manipulation has been sped up to a point that I don't really even have to think about it anymore. I think there's a leap. You get to a point where you jump into AI where you're no longer processing. The computer is processing for you. There's that, just a crossover where you give up, at least the way I see it, I give up some artistic aspects of processing, and I cross over into where the machine is processing my images for me in AI. And then I get to select the image that I prefer. Yes, there's a range of images. What am I doing? Yes, I like the background in that, or I don't like this, or I don't like the color on the face, or whatever. But I have a choice with AI. And I think at that point, you've kind of lost full control of processing. Whereas if you're processing a photograph of, say, a portrait, you're looking at the light, you're looking at the textures, you're looking at the skin, and you're making all sorts of adjustments. You're probably changing the background because you didn't like the light or whatever. But at least you're doing it. And I think there's that gray area where you cross over to where a machine is doing it based on the collective experiences of others, which is basically what AI is doing, to something that you've done personally. And I think that's where the rub comes. I think that's where people have a great deal of difficulty with it. They think they're giving up control. Yes, no, I'm undecided about that, but I personally like to have that control. So would I cross over into AI and use that to manipulate my photographs? The answer is probably not. Even if it's made substantially easier than it is today, which is relatively easy. But I still think if you're wrestling with the creative process to create something that is yours and reflective of what you see, is far more important than letting some machine do some machine searching to come up with something that it thinks is close to what you're looking for. In the past, sculptors and artists would look at a painting or a drawing, and they spent many months, days, years in case of a sculpture, producing their work, their ideas, their concepts. Then there came the photograph. Now, the photograph, I think, was badly understood. It took a point in time, a photograph of a cup or a person or whatever, and that was that point in time. And that was presented as art. Well, it wasn't really art. The art comes after you take the photograph and start manipulating the image. It is doing the same thing that the sculptor and the painter did many years ago, and is still doing today. If you look at the output of a photograph today, the photographer has taken the image, it's fixed in time, puts it into some processing software, and starts manipulating that image, changing the contrast, tones, colors, backgrounds. He's creating something, as was the artist creating several hundred years ago or today. And I think there's a big difference between doing that body of work, from the manipulation of the photograph and the painting, sculptures, to AI, where a machine is doing it for you and allowing you to choose an image. So I think that you've lost that creative process. When I was going to school, high school and everything else, all I wanted to be was a soldier. And I did that. And I realized at the time that there was much more to life than marching around and running around in the bush and playing silly bugger. I wanted to become a teacher because I was a very good instructor. I lasted about, that concept lasted maybe 2 terms. And I decided to give that up and get into economics and accounting. And so I studied business. But I was very fortunate in my first year. I had to take first year English. And I had an instructor, and I had to write an essay on Chaucer of some sort in the first year. And he said to me, "Do you know who Chaucer is?" I said, "Oh yeah, he's a writer sometime, back," and I probably quoted the date correctly and everything else. He said, "No, he's not. He was a churchman. He was a politician. He was a businessman. He was a public servant. And he wrote about his experiences." And it was for me, it was fundamental. And it was a fundamental shift in my life, because I started seeing my life substantially different. In that I was a person who was gaining experiences and gathering about them and gathering those up, and that was my life. So I should try and do other things. I ended up going out to Australia, study accounting, finished my degree out in Australia. I came back, I worked for Macmillan Bloedel here at Paul River and also at Port Alberni. I went to the interior and worked for a company called Evans Products, which is a fairly large US company in the forest products business at the time. And I'd gone on afterwards to buy several other small businesses. And one of the small businesses that I bought, Beta Wood and Marine Products, when I bought it, it had 7 employees, including 2 owners. And the foreman was the foreman because he knew how to tally lumber and knew how to use a tape measure. But all the rest had somewhere between grade 6 and grade 8 educations. It was a very sad situation. I established a company policy that said the company would do everything it could so you could get your grade 12, complete your matriculation. And we will pay for any courses that benefit the company. which we did. It turned out to be a very successful policy because I was able to grow the company from those 5 people, 2 which I lost with the owners, previous owners. They left after a very short period of time. I grew that company to 56 people. And when the company, we third round after 12 years, the third round of countervailing duties came in from the US on softwood lumber. When margins were running at 28%, the countervailing duty came in at 32% and basically wiped me out. But during that process, I was able to help train about, as I said, 50 some odd people. We hired some from outside that were well trained, BCIT and things like that. I produced hardwood flooring. I produced wall paneling, doors, housing components for Japan, precision cuts. And when I shut the business down, within a week, all those employees had jobs elsewhere, primarily based on their education. And I view that as, outside my family, the highlight of my business career. It was a failure, and I managed to, it turned into a success for everybody else. When I decided to retire, I had a couple of goals for myself. And first off was to read some books. I had a list. And I managed to read 52 books in 52 weeks. And the other goal I had for myself was to get back in photography in a deep way. So I enrolled in a photography program. Interesting, the program started at University of Southern California at their Temecula campus. I got one semester there. Then the program was moved to, of all places, VIU. And I did about 3 or 4 sections there, and then the course went to Red Deer, Alberta, the college at Red Deer, Alberta, of all things. And I found it quite fascinating. It was interesting. It covered a lot of aspects of photography. It started off with your basic course of introduction to your camera, and it was camera specific. And then we went on to cover portrait photography and landscapes and action photography. There were some options on real estate, which I didn't take, and some other courses that were, one program on Photoshop. I completed the program. And if I wanted the degree or the diploma, they wanted me to send them $150, I would think it was. So I said, no, thanks. I'll just take the certificates you gave with each one of the sections of the program. But one of the interesting things about that program was I had to, under the portrait section, I had to shoot a wedding. And the wedding was to be someplace local and all that. Of course, I wrote to the instructor and told him I live in Parksville, British Columbia. There are very few weddings around here. However, could I shoot a funeral? And he wrote back and he said, I'd prefer you didn't. And please make another attempt at finding a wedding. Well, I couldn't. And I have 2 nieces. He said, listen, Rick, what we can do for you is we'll get dressed up, we'll stage the wedding at our house, which they did. But the night before I was to do the shoot, I had it all planned out. You had to prepare notes, you had to do all your tell the instructor how you were going to shoot everything and all that. Anyways, the night before, one of my nieces and her boyfriend had a fight, so they dropped out. So we quickly found another girl, and we had a same-sex wedding. So I had all the same shots, wedding shots, and there was an old hot rod involved in the photography as well. Anyways, I sent all my work in, and I apologized for it because it was such rush at the last minute, changing over, and a girl dressed up in a suit. Today it doesn't sound outlandish. At the time, it was very outlandish. Anyways, he gave me full marks and said, "You can hang your shingle up as a wedding photographer anytime." Anyways, and that was the end of my photography. I should say it was probably that was the beginning of my real photography training. It was coming to the club. So, anyways.
I'll give you one last question. You're very goal orientated. You have goals for Tai Chi, you have goals for your trips on your motorcycle and elsewhere, goals for your business, etc. Any thoughts about just goal setting for people in our organization?
Yeah, as far as goal setting goes for the club, I think there are a number of things, and I think you have to rely quite a bit on history. And that is that the club has gone through a period where I think it's gone through a period where it was very technically oriented to where we are today, where we're fairly artistically oriented. And there are many people with huge skill sets sitting inside the club. And so I think that any goal that you set for the club needs to be consider the people we have today. And setting those goals are quite important to club membership and making for a stronger club. Rather than setting a goal and having people achieve the goals, I think it's more important to use the resources that we have and set the goals related to the people that we have. I know we have people involved in Kappa. Maybe it's a good time to get involved in Kappa at another level. If we're going to get involved in video or drones, let's do that. Capitalize on that work. Yes, we may lose a couple of people on the way through, but I think in the end, you end up with a stronger club. And there's no thing that says that, no rule that says that you have to have one goal. I have a goal for film photographers this year. We're going to do this. I have a goal for our, videographers. We're going to do this. And so on. So you might have 3 different goals. And with that, and moving forward, and good communications of those goals and why we're doing it and what we're trying to capitalize on, I think we can probably build a very strong club and a very large club. Because I think there's a lot of interest in the community in photography, but people say, "Oh, I'm only interested in video." Most of your club members are still shooting stills, So we have to reach out to those people, and we can do that with the resources that we have within the club.